All right, guys, so we're going to get started here. Thank you for logging in. This is our first lunch and learn. So hopefully if you guys are interested, we can keep doing these while we're all stuck inside and stuck at home. Last week we did do a rain barrel workshop as well. That recording is up on our website if you guys are interested in checking that out. And we're actually going to review a little bit about what we talked about last week because a lot of it had to do with stormwater. And of course, stormwater is kind of on everyone's minds right now. Just with all the rain that we got last night, this is definitely the time that it's all on our minds. And when we're starting to think, okay, what can we do in our communities to help mitigate these issues with stormwater that we're having? So I'm going to talk a lot about stormwater and why we're getting stormwater, why we're getting more than we typically have in the past, and something that we can do as landowners instead of just relying on our municipalities, but what we can do in our own backyards to help mitigate that and reduce the amount of water that gets into our streams and also the water that is flowing over on our roadways and whatnot. So just a couple of housekeeping notes here. Everyone is automatically muted, should not be sharing their video. If you guys for some reason are not muted, or if you're sharing a video, please just make sure that little red check mark is on those icons so that we're not sharing too much and we're not going over each other, so you guys can hear me pretty well. If you are unable to hear me, if your computer is not working, you can go down the little box with the microphone and you can actually get the audio on your phone. It'll walk you through the whole process and how to set that up. So if you guys are having any trouble hearing that at all, you might want to switch over to your phone and see if that helps out. Video quality. Unfortunately, I'm here at my house on my own Wi-Fi, so I'm hoping that this video quality should work out pretty well. If not, or if you see any pauses in your video, the best advice I have is just log out and log back in. Hopefully that'll do the quick fix for you. Hopefully you guys have all identified the chat box. I'm going to try to answer questions as I go along, but I'm definitely going to leave some time at the end to answer your questions. It can be on topic or off topic, whichever way you guys want to go. But by all means, use that chat box and let me know what you're thinking. These slides are actually already on the website. If you go to our Conservation District website under the Workshops tab, this is actually a workshop or a webinar that I've worked on before. Actually, last year we had a grant to do this. So I modified it a little more for this specific webinar here, but some of the old slides are actually already uploaded onto the website. And hopefully by the end of the weekend, I'll have the recording of this webinar uploaded onto our website as well, if you want to send it to someone or rewatch it. So that being said, let's get started and talk about why we should think about vegetated stormwater protection here in Columbia County. All right. So first things first, you really can't talk about stormwater unless you talk about watersheds. So watersheds are essentially an area of land that collects water after a rainfall, and it drains into a single point. So think of it as like a bathtub, right? When you take a shower, the water goes all over the place, but it drains into one single area. So it's all basically driven by gravity, and most of the watersheds around here are delineated by our mountaintop, right? So when a droplet of rain falls somewhere on the land, that always eventually gets somewhere, whether it's a stream, eventually the bay, eventually the ocean. That's what a watershed is. It collects water and it drives it down to a single point. Now, of course, the water cycle does include that it might be infiltrated into our soils, which eventually goes into groundwater supplies, and that can store water for a lot longer of a time, which is actually something we're going to cover a lot more in this webinar. But just to get thinking about where water goes once you have a rainfall, what's it doing? Now, if we look outside right now, or over the past night, we've seen a lot of stormwater, and you might be getting some pools of water in your yard or seeing things flow down your nearby road, and that right there is stormwater, and that's our biggest concern there. That is water that's not being infiltrated into the soil, and instead it is making its way down to the nearest stream. And unfortunately, that's often what causes our flash flooding that we see around here. And we did see that a little bit yesterday as well. If you look at the map of Pennsylvania, you'll see that we are actually in the light green section. Of course, we're in the Susquehanna River Basin, but it's actually a part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. You probably hear us all the time talking about protecting the bay, but ultimately we're really just protecting our streams in our own backyard. You know, we're protecting the Susquehanna, Fishing Creek, or any little tiny tributary that you might live on. Regardless, it collects water and it is having a big impact on the land around us. So another thing to think about watersheds, if you look at these graphics, is just that watersheds are not just where the streams are, but it has to do with where the interactions between the land and the stream. So what we do on land affects the stream and vice versa. So Pennsylvania is actually a water state. We have a ton of water. In fact, we have 86,000 miles of streams here in Pennsylvania, and that is only second to Alaska. So we actually have more miles of streams than pretty much any other state besides Alaska. In Columbia County in particular, we have 601.6 miles of streams. So we think about little old Columbia County here, but we have a ton of streams to manage. And of course, that means we have a lot of water to manage. So when we have big, heavy rainstorms like yesterday, that becomes a big concern for us, thinking about how much water we have and our capacity to store that water. So I made up this graphic here of Columbia County, and you can see that there are different watersheds within Columbia County, and they're all color-coded, and you can identify which watershed you live in. If you're in that white area, that drains directly right into the Susquehanna River, so you're in the Susquehanna watershed there. And really, all of us are in the Susquehanna watershed. But some of us there are in either Fishing Creek, Briar Creek, Catawissa Creek, or Roaring Creek, and then we do have a couple of other ones like the Chillicothe Creek. And you might notice that some of the lines are different colors. So the blue ones are listed as attaining, and attaining just means that when the state goes through and they look for water quality, they identify those streams as being able to hold wildlife or aquatic organisms and to support them. So that means you're likely to find trout or some sort of aquatic macroinvertebrates in those streams, and they're likely thriving in them. And if you notice that the red streams are listed as non-attaining or impaired. So that basically means that aquatic life is really going to struggle, if not, they're not going to be even identified in that stream. So it would be a really tough job for a trout or something to try to live in those red streams. If you're in Catawissa Creek, that is most likely because of the abandoned mines that are out in that region, and that adds iron and aluminum, and you get this thing called acid mine drainage. So if you see any creeks that are reddish or orangish, or they might have a white film on the water, that is most likely acidic conditions, which again, trout can't live in. All the other red lines are mostly impaired due to agricultural conditions that have fertilizers or erosion going on in those areas, getting into the streams and impairing the ability for those habitats to sustain aquatic life. Oh, and by the way, if you guys live on one of these red streams, by all means, give me a call and contact me if you have any issues. We're often looking for opportunities to go out and improve these streams, looking for grant funding and applying for those types of things so we can do projects to try to improve the quality of water in Columbia County. So if you have any property on those red streams, please give me a call. I'd love to come check it out. So Columbia County, why do we need vegetated stormwater control among other controls that there are? Well, let's look at historic data here. So in Columbia County, on average, we get about 44 inches of rain. You can definitely tell that in the past couple of years, we've been getting way more than that. 2018, when we had all those crazy floods, we had 61 inches of rain that year. Last year, we had 51 inches of rain, and this year is up in the air. But judging by what we're looking at from yesterday's rain and what's supposed to happen on later today, it seems like we're still on that trend. Hopefully, we can keep it lower. But of course, with climate change, that is projected to increase over time. So we do have to find a way to adapt to this because there's really no way you can control the weather. So outside of the weather, we're going to have to try to control the stormwater. And stormwater in particular is much of a concern, because not only because of the flooding that we have, but the pollution that it's able to pick up and bring into our streams, as well as the energy that it has, making major erosion and landscape changes. And then when it finally releases this energy, you get all these debris deposits, and it's just kind of wreaking havoc in this area and really just across the nation. In addition to annual rainfalls increasing, we're also losing our capacity to store water within the landscape. So think about that watershed concept again. We are building our communities on top of floodplains. We're filling in wetlands. We honestly don't have that many healthy soils left that can hold that water, and we're also taking away a lot of our forests. So we're taking away the ecosystem services that would naturally hold water and mitigate water. We're taking them away, and we're pretty much telling the water figure out where to go, and 9 times out of 10 that's going to be right into its local stream. So I always like to kind of drive home the point, and I'll do this early, that increasing rainfall and land use and development on the land is largely a part of the problem that we're seeing with stormwater, because we don't have permeable surfaces as much as we used to. We're removing all of the vegetation, and we're also channelizing our streams, which is really increasing energy and causing a lot of problems here. So why are we concerned? I think that these photos say it all. So these photos are actually from 2018. Obviously, we saw a ton of damage going on, and that's a huge concern for us, not even just for environmental conservation, but just, you know, protection of property and safety of others. Something that you're going to notice in all these photos that there's no trees or minimal trees, and there's no buffers along the stream. You'll notice that people are mowing right up to the stream bank, and that really destabilizes those banks and makes it so that they're able to get eroded and moved around. You also notice that ditches are unable to, you know, hold excessive rainfalls. You know, they're not as big as a stream, so they simply just cannot hold that much water when that much water is going through them. Of course, when you have high energy systems, you're going to have a lot of more deposits of larger materials. Instead of just pebbles, you're going to get these really big rocks, the higher energy that you have. And something else to note here is, you know, the conservation district is primarily concerned about, you know, our natural resources and water quality, and sediment is actually Pennsylvania's #1 pollutant. So it's actually our biggest concern, and events like these are exactly what is causing decline in a lot of our streams and waterways. And one other thing that I do want to drive home here is that there's actually a difference between flash flooding and flooding. So those are actually 2 different types of events. Flooding, as most of us are familiar with, is when something like the Susquehanna floods and it floods like the town of Williamsburg. Unfortunately, that is nearly impossible to mitigate, and it's very difficult to mitigate. Most of that water, it occurs over a long period of time, so it may take days for that water to accumulate in order for it to rise to floodplain level. And that's what flooding is. It's normal and natural, and it's pretty much unpreventable. But having wetlands and floodplains is really the best way that we can mitigate those issues. However, flash flooding is pretty much what you're seeing in these photos here. Flash flooding is actually not as natural as regular flooding. Typically, you know, before we came in here and colonized, you know, Pennsylvania, there were forests everywhere, and wetlands and these streams looked a lot different than they do today. So traditionally, there really wouldn't have been too much flash flooding because there would have been enough capacity on the landscape to hold that water. And flash flooding really occurs when you have excessive rainfall that happens within minutes to a few hours, as opposed to flooding that would happen over days. So it's unexpected, it's very dangerous, it has a lot of energy, and it happens when you don't have the capacity on your landscape to hold that water, and instead it gets into your streams and it's got to go somewhere. So what's generating so much stormwater? Well, first we have to define what stormwater is. So stormwater is rainfall that flows over the ground surface. So it basically is water that is unable to soak into the ground. So think back to that watershed concept. Stormwater starts on land, and then it goes into the stream. So we really can't blame our streams for the stormwater concerns that we have here. Now, ideally, it would be infiltrated into the soils, but unfortunately, in most cases around here, it's going right into a stream because there's no buffers along our stream to hold that water in there. So it's created when you create an impervious surface in your watershed. And that can be things like roads and driveways, parking lots, rooftops in your house, sidewalks, you name it. If you can't infiltrate water, that would be generating your stormwater. Now, in a natural system, like I mentioned earlier, runoff is going to be pretty minimal because if you have healthy soils and vegetative covers, wetlands and floodplains, you would be able to have the capacity to store that excess water that we'd be getting. Now, if you look at this graphic, you start in the top left image, you'll see that only about 10% of runoff occurs when you have a forested landscape. And as you go from left to right, you'll see that as we build houses and suburbs and eventually cities, we're just increasing the amount of stormwater that we're getting. And again, all of that is going to go right into the nearby stream that's passed. So things that we can, or at least things that we're doing in the landscape that is causing runoff, things like removing our trees in our forests or vegetation, replacing those with short mowed turf grasses, which is going to be primarily the focus of this webinar, but also just developing on floodplains and reducing the stream's ability to spread out that energy. Urbanizing our areas and filling our wetlands are really not helping the situation here. So permeable versus impermeable surfaces, I keep saying that word. A permeable surface means it allows water to percolate into the soil. So an example of that would be a floodplain, a grassy area, forest, or what I'm going to talk about later, no mow zones. Impermeable surfaces, on the other hand, don't allow water to be absorbed. So I mentioned earlier about rooftops and roads and those types of surfaces. So you have rooftops, roads, sidewalks, pavement, parking lots, and something else that we don't typically think about, but I always say they are semi-impermeable if you have a very, very heavy rainfall. Croplands and turf grass, your own lawn, is going to create a lot of stormwater. If it doesn't have the capacity to infiltrate into the soil, it's going to go downstream. And you might look in your lawn and see that the water's flowing and not just sitting there in a pool. So that being said, the majority of our landscapes are cropland and turf grass. And unfortunately, that covers the majority of the surfaces. So there's actually a way that you can calculate your property's stormwater runoff. You don't have to do this right now, it's just kind of an example, but 1 inch of rain gives you about 0.6 gallons of water per square feet. So there's a pretty simple calculation that you can do there. For example, if you have 1,000 square feet of impermeable surfaces, that would be about 600 gallons in a 1 inch rainstorm. We just had about a 2 inch rainstorm last night, so that would be about 1,200 gallons. So you can kind of do the math there and figure out how much stormwater your property is generating. And you can do that with or without turf grass. Obviously in a 1 inch rainstorm, you're most likely going to absorb that water over time. However, when you have very, very large rainstorms like yesterday, that suddenly becomes saturated and unable to absorb more water than we would like. I actually took this a little bit a step forward as I was putting this presentation together, and I actually went on a website called Model My Watershed. It's a great resource. It's free, open to the public, and you guys can get onto it. Take this data with a grain of salt, but if you can look at Columbia County and look at our land use there. We are very fortunate that we have a lot of deciduous forests and ground covers in that aspect. But again, I did mention those croplands, depending on how they're being managed, may or may not be generating stormwater. And you'll notice that we also have a ton of developed open space. Not only does that include parking lots and buildings and urbanization, but that also includes lawns. So I took that a step further and I looked at our soils, and we can actually look at our soils by infiltration rates. I isolated just C&D, so slow to very slow infiltration rates, and I got the square footage of Columbia County with slow to very slow infiltration rates. And I calculated that we have almost 500,000 gallons of water, potential storm water, in a 1-inch rainstorm. So that's pretty crazy. That's a lot of water to manage during a rainstorm, and we're not really thinking about it, right? Because we're just kind of thinking about our small, properties that we have, but collectively, that's a lot of water that if it's not being mitigated properly, that's going right into the stream, and of course, that's causing flooding that we really don't want to see that very much. Then I took another step forward and I said about 40 inches per year. Now that's actually less than the average historical data, and as I showed you guys earlier, we're getting even more rain per year, but just if we got 40 inches of rain per year, that is billions of gallons of water that we are going to have to deal with annually. So again, this is a big problem. It's a growing problem as we have heavier rainstorms over time with climate change. We're really going to have to start thinking about what we're going to be doing with this extra stormwater. And it's going to be tough to rely on the municipalities and the government to manage this themselves. I largely really advocate for landowners with turf grasses to really consider mitigating this together as a community. Just really, really quickly, I keep talking about managing our land instead of our streams, but something the Conservation District gets all the time, we always get the question of why are we not dredging? And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what dredging is. So dredging is when you go into a stream system and we basically try to increase the capacity for water to flow into it, which on paper sounds wonderful, but unfortunately that's not really how nature works. So just very briefly, I want to talk about dredging a little bit here, just because I know it's a question on a lot of people's minds. So if you just think about it, as we dig into the stream, you're creating a deeper and steeper environment, which means the water's going to move faster. When you have fast water, you create more energy. So when we're looking at all that destruction that happens here, it really would not help the situation. If you add more energy to the stream, you're just going to get more erosion and deposition. Streams are extremely dynamic systems. They're always seeking what we call in a dynamic equilibrium. So they are always changing. They're always reacting to everything that we do on the land, and they're not really going to stop doing that. There's no way to stabilize a stream. Now, you can try to stabilize it in the short term, but you really have to think long term about these streams. These streams were here before our houses were here. So they're not trying to figure out how to adjust themselves around the house. They're streams. They simply don't really care about that type of stuff. Unfortunately, the other thing about dredging is it actually increases your flood damage. So as I mentioned earlier, you have more energy. And something I hear a lot, I always find it interesting, people are talking about certain stretches of our local streams and asking, why aren't we dredging them? And they're always very surprised to hear that very particular stream section, we've dredged in the past. We've dredged it in the 70s, we've dredged it in the 30s, and now they want to dredge it here in the 2000s. Unfortunately, that's never helped the situation. In fact, it's always created a worse problem. So I definitely do not advocate for dredging. You can see in those graphics what happens when you dredge. You end up creating head cuts. That basically is just erosion that occurs upstream, and that erosion ends up just filling in that hole that you created. You also get bank failures, and again, all those issues that we don't want to see in our streams that we're often seeing. So a better idea would be to work with nature, which is what I'm proposing here, and that's largely trying to establish a sequence of ripple and pools, which you would see in a natural system that manages energy, as well as reestablishing those floodplains and those meanders that a stream actually would form in order to manage its energy. So that's my kind of really brief overview of dredging. And we also have some information on our website if you guys are interested in any more information on that. But I hope that drove home that dredging really is not the solution here. It's also really expensive and an extremely short-term solution. So hopefully we can kind of look ahead at a long-term solution, and no mow zones are actually a very viable option for that. So what can we do as landowners here in Columbia County? I always say is slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. So that's going to be the goal today. Talking about how can we do that, just as landowners, you know, that have just a simple yard or a couple of acres here. So we can do that by establishing the mow zones at our houses and even our businesses. We can plant riparian buffers along streams. And riparian just means stream side, so that's putting trees along your streams, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. If you're a farmer, you can consider using cover crops and no-till practices that really help improve your soil. You can encourage forest cover and smarter land development in our communities, and also setting aside floodplains and wetlands for our streams to spread out on and try not to develop on them. So the difference between those no mow zones and riparian buffers. Now, when I say no mow zone, I don't necessarily mean that I want you guys to stop mowing completely. While that would be ideal, it's not very realistic in a lot of situations, especially those of us that live here in the suburbs or right in town. So you can either stop mowing, or you can reduce mowing, your frequency, or you can raise your mower height. There's going to be a couple of options that I'm going to talk about here, but I don't necessarily mean stop mowing altogether, but you can mow for maintenance as opposed to for aesthetics. And then riparian buffers, we're going to talk about them a little bit later on. And again, riparian just means stream size. And that just means that you're going to be encouraging trees and shrubs along your streams to grow, minimal mowing whatsoever in there, and that's going to create a ton of habitat as well. So there's some other benefits to these things as well. If you're concerned about helping pollinators, mowing just a couple of times per year and creating a meadow in your backyard would be ideal. If you're in town and you have certain ordinance restrictions, something as simple as raising your mower's height or mowing less frequency would actually make a significant difference in generating stormwater. And also, if you're interested primarily in building wildlife habitat, I'm going to go for the no mow or minimal mowing to encourage trees to grow or managing for grasslands. So no mow zones, and they're pretty much as simple as this photo here. It's taking our lawns and converting them to areas that have a lot of vegetative growth. So that's going to benefit not just for stormwater retention, but for pollinators and wildlife that are looking for areas to survive on and raise their young at. So one of these topics that I'm personally really interested in, and it's kind of nerdy of me, but I love the history of the American lawn. So NOAA and NASA actually did a study very recently, and they found we had over 63,000 square miles of lawn in America. That's about the size of Texas. You can see the map there collectively. We have a ton of lawn here in America that is simply not designed to be collecting stormwater or really giving any ecological benefit to our communities at all. In addition to that, manicuring our lawn uses a ton of water. So we're adding water where we don't even want it to be, and it actually really decreases our ability to sequester carbon and mitigate climate change. Because you're using gasoline for your lawnmowers and adding fertilizers, it really is actually not beneficial to be putting those into the environment. There's a really brief history of the American lawn. When we first came here, the turf grass that we see today was not here. That's actually an invasive species. So originally we had native grasses, and when we brought cattle over here and sheep, they were basically found that the grasses here were less nutritional than the grasses over in Europe. So what the colonists did was they brought their grasses from Europe over here because they were more nutritious, right? So they brought those weeds that we call dandelions and plantains and those types of things, and they brought them over. And of course, what does an invasive species do? It spreads all over the place. So now we have, Kentucky bluegrass that's actually from Europe all over the place. Not only that, but Europe ended up starting to do these pretty much basically lawn care. And there was a sign of wealth over in England. And of course, Thomas Jefferson just loved his gardens, and he wanted to flaunt his wealth. So Thomas Jefferson famously kind of brought that idea over to his Monticello garden And it became a sign of wealth in America as well. Skip over to, the Industrial Revolution and post-World War II, suddenly the middle class has a lot more money, and there's a ton more technology out there to improve the health of our grasses. And today, turf grass is actually America's #1 irrigated crop, and it's actually 3 times bigger than America's corn crop. So just driving home, we have a ton of lawn that doesn't really add any ecological benefit to us, and it also really is not helping us manage our stormwater. So there's different options that we can do in terms of how to manage our lawn. And, traditionally we would all have homesteads. I don't expect everyone to have their own homestead today, but it certainly is another option. You can really, add a lot of gardens, you can reforest your landscape, put a no mow zone in there. And that bottom right-hand photo is actually my property. I live right here in the middle of Mifflinville, so I have some restrictions. So what I do is I raise my mower height, and we always try to mow above the clover, or in this case right now, we're trying to mow above the violet, just to make sure that we have that ground cover there. And in the summertime, that back corner back there, we actually create pollinator habitat, so that'll all be meadow area. But these are different options. You see the American lawn style there, and really it's kind of like a desolate place. There's really no ecological value. There's really no aesthetic value to it. It's just kind of a maintenance thing, and it's just kind of what everyone else does, so we keep doing it. But I really like everyone to start thinking about other options that we can do to manage our lawn. Here's just a couple of other examples of what we can do. Of course, you can put some wildflowers in there and really make it pretty and enjoyable. And then you can also, add walking paths in there and add some sort of benefit in terms of for your health. And not only that, but of course, we're mitigating a ton of stormwater, and we're helping build habitat for wildlife as well. So again, there would be reasons why you would want to mow or to not mow. If you do decide to mow, it's a great mechanism for maintaining grasslands and meadow habitat. So, mowing a couple times per year, there's nothing wrong with that. Also, mowing to deal with noxious weeds that we have, invasive species that we have, mowing is often a good mitigation tool for that. Again, if you're trying to create habitat for wildlife, doing maintenance mowing is definitely something that you should be thinking about. And of course, there's other issues with mowing. If you have a local zoning ordinance that requires it, you'll definitely want to stay within your municipality's policies and adhere to those. However, the benefits of not mowing, of course, mowing can be expensive. You have to buy fuel, and you have to maintain your equipment. Also, not mowing, or at least not mowing frequently, provides a lot of really great habitat for wildlife to nest in and raise their young. Grasses, if we don't mow them, they help take in nutrients and they prevent erosion. Mowing takes time, so it saves you a ton of time. It also helps our environment, and it helps trees and shrubs establish. So there's some benefits to depending on what your situation is and where you're living and what your goals are. If you mow or you don't mow, there's definitely different options for you to go with. So why am I talking about plants here? Why do we think that plants are going to help with stormwater? Well, I think that we all know that there's countless benefits to plants. Obviously they act as a natural sponge with the root systems that they have. And they act as a physical barrier for stormwater. So they not only physically stop and slow down it, but they help spread it out and absorb it with the roots. And those roots also add an additional benefit by holding in soil in place. So we're really preventing a lot of erosion from going on there. Additionally, plants filter out heavy metals and other chemicals that we don't want on our land. Of course, they provide a lot of food and habitat. They provide cooling effects as well. They help sequester carbon dioxide, so they help mitigate climate change, and especially native plants really help reduce the need of fertilizers or pesticides, and they benefit native wildlife because they've been here for so long. They're designed pretty much to survive in the conditions here in Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to throw this slide up here. I always think it's really interesting to check out the difference between native and non-native grasses. And again, a native grass is something that's been here long enough before, we settled this area. So native grasses have been here, they've adjusted to our soils and our weathers and our climate, and they thrive here. And not only that, but the wildlife kind of also evolved with these plants as well. So if you look at this photo here, you'll see the turf grass doesn't have very much root. And again, it's because it's from Europe. I'm willing to bet if you went over to Europe and looked at their root length, they're probably a lot healthier over in Europe than they are here, simply because they evolved over there. However, typically when you think about stormwater retention and healthy soils, you want to look at the plant's root mass. So those roots that you see from all the other, native grasses in those photos, those roots are creating little channels for water to be stored in, right? So creating capacity within our soils to store water, and that water that gets absorbed into the soils is never going to reach the stream. Or if it does, it'll end up in the groundwater supply and end up in the stream from the groundwater. But that would absolutely not cause any flash flooding or any of the benefit or the non-beneficial effects of stormwater. So just really, keeping that in mind that turf grass, while it does technically infiltrate water, it has such a limited capacity compared to other native grasses to be able to do that. You can also see, some of those roots go super deep. I mean, 10, 15 feet underground. So that's a ton of water. If you have something like a compost plant or that switchgrass growing in your yard, that's a ton of water, beneath the surface that you can't see that we're storing that wouldn't end up over in the nearby stream that we have. And likewise for agriculture, you can look at, wheat versus native grasses. Wheat is just another type of grass. However, definitely they have a shorter root system, and it really does not help the health of our soils and our ability to retain stormwater that way. I just threw this up here because every time I talk about native grasses, people ask me what type of native grasses are there. So here's just a couple. We have Indian grasses, switchgrass. You guys might have heard of like wild rye is really great for stabilizing structure because it grows so fast. Blue stem. There's definitely a whole bunch of different native grasses that are out there. But here's just a couple of examples. They really don't look too much different than invasive grasses, except that, of course, they grow bigger and taller, and a lot of them, kind of tend to bunch up as opposed to spreading out like turf grass does. In addition to, plants, we have trees, which are also plants, and I think we all know that they provide endless benefits to the environment. I just threw up a whole bunch of ideas up there, and the list can go on and on and on. So trees are extremely beneficial when it comes to the environment, especially with managing rainwater that we have. So just a couple of quick facts here. One deciduous tree can actually intercept between 700 to 1,000 gallons of water annually. As that is just one tree, like an oak or a maple. And interception means that, all the leaves on that tree are collecting water as well. And the water that lands on those leaves can eventually actually evaporate back into the atmosphere. So that is water when you're intercepting. That's water that is never going to reach the surface of the ground, let alone into a stream. So that's just one tree with that many leaves can really reduce that much stormwater. What's even more amazing is that evergreen trees can intercept over 4,000 gallons of rainwater annually. And it's just because they have more surface area with all of their needles. So it's pretty amazing what planting a couple of trees in your yard can do for mitigating stormwater. So if you're not into the no-mow idea, by all means, please plant a couple of trees because that'll help just as much. On average in Pennsylvania, if you look at our forests in Pennsylvania over our state forests that are pretty well managed, about 60% of the rainfall that lands in there is actually taken up by the trees and transpired back into the atmosphere. So that is water that's never going to reach the stream. And when we remove those forests or we harvest them for products, the evaporation rate declines, and therefore we end up with more water in our streams. So there's definitely a huge benefit to not only planting a couple of trees, but for encouraging forests in our communities again as well. And not only do they mitigate that, but they also really take up a lot of pollutants that we don't want in our landscape, and they store it for long periods of time in their wood. So again, trees are really, really beneficial for these types of issues. So if you're not into the no-mow idea, by all means, please consider thinking about getting some trees in your property. So how does a no-mow zone work? This is actually extremely simple. You know, I have an entire webinar just on this concept. But all you have to do is identify an area of land that you're not using. So you set aside that piece of land that you have. The first thing you're going to want to do is look at it for any invasive species. Obviously, if you don't have any present, you can move on to the next step. If you do have an invasive species, you'll want to deal with that first. But the worst thing you can do is have an invasive species on your property and then completely stop mowing and mitigating your property there. Suddenly you're going to have something like a mile a minute or silt grass all over your yard, and trust me, you really don't want that. If you guys have any issues with identifying invasive species, by all means, I'm happy to come out to your property and survey it and see if you guys have any, and I can give you a plan for trying to get rid of those. And there's also many resources online. DCNR has a whole bunch about identifying those invasive species. But if you don't have any, you would want to move on to your next step. So you'd want to establish and encourage new plants. Pretty easy as that. You just let them grow. So you can either buy plants, or you can just let whatever plants are in your yard already kind of grow and thrive that way. So you may want to consider different mowing frequencies. And this is what I was talking about earlier about how you don't necessarily have to stop mowing completely. There are other options. So if you want to basically have a baseline of what I recommend, I always recommend to never mow below your violet clovers, or in general, just under 3 inches. You're going to want to make sure that your lawn is always at least 3 inches or higher. If you mow once every 2 weeks, that is, there's a lot of studies that have found that that is what is best for pollinators, if that's your goal. And if you're interested in creating habitat or having more trees and shrub growth on your property, mowing about 2 to 3 times a year would be a lot better to get that kind of environment. And either frequency is going to help retain stormwater. It's going to really improve your ability to improve your soils and build that capacity. So depending on if you're looking for pollinator habitat, or if you just simply want to have better means of managing stormwater, whatever your goals are, you can manage your mowing frequency based off of that. But overall, you want to make sure that a healthy lawn has a diverse array of plants. So you're going to want a lot of diversity going on there. You don't just want one monocrop, which is what we typically see with turf grasses. Because if you have a whole bunch of different types of plants, you're going to be able to absorb water better. You're going to slow that stormwater down. You're going to reduce your pollutants, and you're going to also attract more pollinators and wildlife and be able to build your soil and have a more healthy ecosystem that way. So where do you get those plants? You don't necessarily have to go out and buy any plants. You can just let those weeds grow. Things like dandelions and other native plants that are out there, or actually dandelions are invasive as well, but fortunately they're not much of a nuisance problem, and they're actually very beneficial for bees. But you can just let your property grow, or you can try to go and get some native grass seed mixes if you want to completely get rid of your turf grasses. There's also wildflower mixes out there. There's even no-mow lawn seed, which that photo in the bottom left is actually a photo of that. It gets about 12 inches tall, and that point, the weight of the grass ends up kind of just falling over, so it kind of naturally maintains itself. And just a little plug there, every year the Conservation District has a plant and tree sale. So definitely get on our email list if you want to check that out. Unfortunately, we had to cancel that for this year. Unfortunately, we had to do that, but we're definitely going to plan on bringing that back next year. So if you guys want to hop on our email list to let us know, that you're interested, and then we can let you know when that opens up for ordering again. So you guys can definitely look into purchasing plants, but you by all means don't have to. You can simply let the grasses on your property that are there right now just grow to their full potential. So where can you put a no-mow zone? There's a whole bunch of options. So in most cases, you'll want to look at unused open spaces, just like the photos you see here. You can also put them along roadsides, along streams, and also along your swales and your ditches. So especially in those areas where you see water flowing is where you'll want to primarily focus on that. And there wouldn't be, that tough of a decision, considering that you most likely aren't able to mow there very well anyway. You'll probably be making ditches with your tires. So those are pretty much the most self-explanatory areas. But if there's an area that, you're not utilizing, by all means, put a little meadow in there or plant some trees. You can really get creative with this and where you're going to put them. So I know that there's a lot of concern out there for urban and suburban yards. It's probably the majority of us, to be honest with you. I definitely encourage all of us to talk to your local township or borough and see what you can and cannot do and figure out what your zoning ordinances require. For example, I live here in Mifflinville, and our requirement is 12 inches or higher is in violation. So it has to be less than 12 inches here on my property, which is pretty easy. I know, I'm sure that down in Bloomsburg that it's a lot less. But if you just want kind of a general gauge on how tall your grass is, you can see that white clover grows between 5 and 8 inches tall, so that's definitely within range. Violets grow between 4 and 6 inches, and dandelions grow between 2 and 10 inches. So you can use those plants, which most of us have in our yards, as an indicator of how tall your grass is for management. You can also set aside pollinator garden areas and see if your township is okay with that, or even put in a rain garden. That would also really help mitigate stormwater. There are actually systems that are designed for stormwater retention. And you can also look into planting ground covers that are lower to the ground, as well as trees and shrubs. Typically, there's not many ordinances on planting trees, but there may or may not be. So again, we'll want to check in with your township on what they require. If your goal is to create pollinator habitat, pollinators are very important. They produce 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat. About half of our world's oils and fibers and raw materials also come from those plants that those pollinators are pollinating. The USDA has actually found, they were looking at different rates of mowing, and they found that if you mow every 2 weeks, that will support 30% more bees than if you mow your lawn weekly. If you mow your lawn weekly, basically what you're doing is cutting all of those flowers, and so you're really decreasing the chances of those bees finding a food source. And if you mow it every 3 weeks, what happens is your grass actually ends up growing so tall that it covers up a lot of those flowers that were there, so it makes it harder for the bees to find the flowers for foraging. So that being said, they really recommend every 2 weeks if you're going to be trying to support bees in your yard, because that seems to be the optimal amount of floral resources for them. So managing our roadsides and our ditches, obviously those are areas that are designed to capture stormwater runoff, but these are also really important nesting and foraging areas for our birds and other wildlife that we have. So I'd recommend mowing once every 2 to 3 years there, and mowing at a minimum of 8 to 12 inches. That'll prevent woody growth, but overall it'll still allow our ditches to grow and maintain those really important wildlife and edge habitats that we have. Also, you want to mow in the late summer between August 1st and 31st because that allows most nesting birds and small mammals to successfully rear their young, and so that they're not getting mowed over. Because unfortunately, when you have high grasses, you don't see what's inside of those grasses, and there might be something that you would normally want to avoid in there. Just in case you guys are curious, this is actually from the Game Commission, but you can see the wildlife nesting period, or when not to mow, is basically during the spring and summer. So in general, if you're going to go with a no-mow zone and you want to maintain mowing it, you'll want to kind of wait until the late summer and late winter or early spring before everything starts coming out to mow if you're trying to manage for wildlife. So what about wildlife, mosquitoes, and aesthetics, which are pretty much the three biggest concerns that people have whenever I talk about these no-mow zones. In terms of wildlife, you're definitely going to be attracting more beneficial insects and songbirds. You might get some little box turtles in your yard. You know, depending where you're at, you're going to get more wildlife, and a lot of it's going to be more welcome wildlife. You're going to get dragonflies, which actually eat and prey on mosquitoes. So that may be a concern for you guys, but you guys can definitely count on getting more beneficial insects and songbirds out in your properties. Now, of course, you may come in contact with other animals that you don't want if it's not mowed. So a lot of people have concerns about getting mice and snakes, and I've gotten a lot of questions from that. 9 times out of 10, if you're going to have mice, they're probably there already in a nearby field. So it's not necessarily bringing out the mice and creating more habitat. It just allows for them to disperse a little better. The animals typically are always there. It's just now they're more visible because they're in your backyard. That being said, if you really, really hone in on trying to create a good biodiversity in your yard, you should also be introducing, you know, predators such as, you know, like red-tailed hawks and things like that, which also eat the snakes and those mice. Owls will also do that as well. So you may come across unwanted animals, but do keep in mind that that is still very beneficial for the environment, and that there are other critters that you might welcome and enjoy on your property itself. So whatever you guys are thinking there. But in terms of mosquitoes, actually before I was a watershed specialist for the Conservation District, I was actually a mosquito technician for Northumberland County. So I know mosquitoes very, very well. And mosquitoes, the ones that we're concerned about, they breed primarily in stagnant water and stagnant organic water. And when I say organic, that just basically means, you know, grass clippings or leaves or things that break down in the water over time and make for like stinky water. So those mosquitoes are really attracted to smelly water. And most of the time we find that people with ruts in their yards or have, you know, wet spots that really hold water there and on top of the turf grass will breed mosquitoes. So again, actually creating a habitat where you have taller grasses so that that water is able to infiltrate as opposed to sitting on top of the turf grass is actually going to decrease the amount of mosquitoes that you see. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to have other beneficial insects that actually eat the mosquitoes. And if you're lucky enough, you may actually be able to build habitat for bats, which are a big driver of managing mosquito populations in the area. And finally, aesthetics. You know, some people are like, wow, that's a lot of weeds and, you know, it's not going to look very well kept. But of course, there's definitely options for you to encourage wildflowers in those areas and get some color in there and get some blooms and colors. And it doesn't have to look bad, even if you put a walking path in there. You can definitely manage the aesthetics of a no-mow zone so it doesn't just look like you're being lazy and not mowing your yard. You can definitely encourage people to look at it and see that it's actually pretty nice to look at over time, especially if you have like birds and stuff, you know, flying around in there and just kind of utilizing it and making it look natural. There's a couple of programs you can even get into if you are interested in really creating a wildlife habitat or a pollinator-friendly habitat. There's a lot of certificate programs that you can go on online and say what you're doing, and they can send you some plaques to say, hey, this is pollinator habitat. You can also talk with your neighbors and really encourage them to connect your no-mow zone to theirs and really create a community effort. in this. And also, there's no limits to it. You can talk to your municipal offices about, what you're trying to do, get them on board, and maybe even be able to change those local ordinances to allow for these types of stormwater controls. Municipalities are absolutely very concerned about stormwater, so if you're putting in an effort to try to manage it for them, they'll most likely thank you for it. Another option is just to do some general education. You can put up a sign to let people know what you're doing. Again, this is my backyard when my grasses started to finally grow taller, and we actually have these signs available at the Conservation District from the grant that we received last year. So if you guys are interested in putting a sign in your yard to kind of tell people what you're doing, by all means, give us a call. I think we have maybe like 15 or 20 of these left. So if you guys want them, hopefully after all this COVID stuff ends, we can get these out to you. So that's definitely available as well. Really quickly, I'm going to talk about riparian buffers. Again, riparian means stream side, so this is basically just putting in plants along the stream that slows down the water and prevents it from getting into the stream. So I'm going to play a little bit of a quiz here. So if everyone can get their chat box out, if you can just let me know, what do you guys think? Does this picture here look like a healthy or stable stream? Someone said terrible, right? So no, that really is not stable. It's not very healthy. They're mowing right up to the stream bank. There's a lot of erosion going on. Not what we want to see, right? So how about this image here? What do you guys think about this one? Better? All right, so we're getting a little better. So I put closer there. You can still see that we're still mowing right up to that stream bank. There is some soil exposed, but it's not nearly as bad as the one before. Jen Wisner definitely said there's no trees. That is key. Definitely a great observation there. All right, what do you guys think about this one? Good. Love it. All right, good. All right, so this is much better, right? I'm going to do one better. What do you guys think about this one? That's the best. Right. I even put the answer in there, guys, in for you guys. So yeah, what are you guys noticing about that? What makes that difference in the top left photo? It is beautiful. I mean, I don't know about you. I would love to be able to go and see streams like that every day, So definitely a lot better looking. You'll notice that there are trees there. And not only are there trees, but there's roots stabilizing those soils. There's also riffles and rocks. So those are, what I mentioned earlier, those riffles and pools, those are really decreasing the energy of the stream and slowing it down. You'll notice there's no erosion on the banks. In fact, there's not very many banks, so to speak. They're not very high. It has access to its floodplain, so it can spread out. So you're not going to be seeing very much erosion whatsoever there. And if you don't have erosion, you're most likely not going to get deposition either. You'll notice it's very shallow and wide. Streams typically really want to be shallow and wide. They don't want to be small in size and really deep like what most of our streams look like. A natural stream, if you go in an untouched area such as this one in the bottom right, you're going to notice that they're actually very shallow in that in most cases you can walk right across one and not even get it up to your knees. And definitely I can safely assume that there's probably some fish in this environment. It's definitely healthy and it looks like it can provide a variety of habitat for wildlife as well. So riparian buffers, I could talk all day about these, so I'm just going to really kind of talk really briefly about them. But primarily they protect against flooding. And they also filter a ton of nutrients for fertilizers and pesticides and stuff like that from the environment and prevents it from getting into the stream. It slows down our runoff so that water never gets to our stream. It helps stabilize our banks with the root systems that it has in there. And again, those trees, like I talked earlier, are really going to intercept that rainfall with their leaves so that it never even is able to reach the ground. You can see in that top photo there as well, that mowing up to the stream bank really actually increases your runoff. And when you have runoff, you're going to have a lot more erosion. And a lot of the time when I have people that call me and ask me to look at their properties, I'll notice that they're almost always mowing right up to the stream bank. So, you know, putting a buffer area with high grasses and trees in there is really going to help protect your yard. And instead of having a stream flowing through it, you'll be able to have the yard so that you guys can enjoy it and, you know, play around with your kids on it and enjoy that for a much longer period of time. Some other benefits of stream buffers: not only does it protect our stream banks and filter pollution, it reduces our flood damage, creates wildlife habitat, and it provides shade in streams. So trout in particular are cold water species, and they require cold water in shaded areas for themselves to live. They really can't handle warm water environments. So that's the other thing. If you're trying to help our trout populations, trees are almost vital to their survival. And not only that, but I mean, trees are pretty looking, so they improve the aesthetic value of our landscapes as well, and makes it look a lot more natural, which is just overall really good for our mental health and also for wildlife and everything else. There's a place down closer to Philadelphia called the Stormwater Research Center. If you guys came to our flooding workshop back in September, these guys were there. They do wonderful presentations, and they have really great information and research that they're doing. And they primarily focus on looking at riparian buffers and improving water quality. And basically they found by looking at forested streams that they reduce a ton of pollution and nitrogen from our agricultural systems from getting into the stream. And because you have healthier water quality, you have more biological activity, which is including the little macroinvertebrates that live inside of the stream that really help to filter and clean things up. Not only that, but they also create a whole bunch of wildlife habitat and food and cooler temperatures. And then something to note that you're going to see if you inquire about getting a buffer on your property, we're going to ask you, you know, how wide do you want your buffer to be? Typically, most of the time when we try to look at getting a buffer in, we try to at least put it in about 30 feet wide or more. So if you have a 33-foot wide buffer, they found that it traps about 54% of the sediment coming out of that stormwater. So that's over half of the sediment in the stormwater is actually getting filtered and never reaching the stream. And then if you increase that and create a 100-foot buffer, you actually trap 84% of that sediment. So the extra 20% is all those really finer, smaller materials that are getting caught over in that buffer, and it never ends up in the stream, and it really improves our water quality. So Stroud does a lot of really great research, and they have a lot of really great videos on their website as well. So if you're interested in more information on riparian buffers, I definitely recommend checking those guys out. Pennsylvania also is really pushing getting streams reforested in our area. They have a goal of planting 95,000 acres of riparian buffers by the year 2025. And that's primarily within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, because Pennsylvania is definitely a large contributor to the pollutants that are ending up in the bay there. So that being said, Pennsylvania in particular has a ton of opportunities to get trees on the ground, which is good for you because that means you can get some free trees. And not only that, but it helps you manage your stormwater on your properties as well. Multifunctional riparian buffers is something that keeps getting thrown out there once in a while. And this is an option. We have grants for these available that we can apply for to get you these. They are riparian buffers that also include opportunities to harvest products. So you can put like hazelnuts or blueberries or florals for, you know, floral arrangements. If you guys are interested in like elderberries or persimmons, there's a ton of wild edible nuts and fruits that you can plant in these riparian buffers. So not only are we mitigating our streams and our stormwater, but we are also able to potentially harvest these products and create an economic benefit, or you can even just enjoy them in your own backyard just for yourself. But it's definitely another option, and we do have grant funding available to do these types of buffers for you guys. Not only that, but last year we became a partner with the Keystone 10 Million Trees Partnership. They are basically a really big partnership that has a goal of planting 10 million trees throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we are now a partner of those. So basically, about twice a year, they will contact me and say, hey, how many trees do you want? Where do you want them to go? And they are completely free. They also come with shelters and stakes, which again are also completely free. So if you guys have any interest in getting free trees, of course you will need to come up with some volunteers to be able to plant those trees. And we do have a minimum of 100 or more trees for each property. But if you guys have a streamside that could certainly use some trees, and if you have some friends or coworkers or family that can help you plant them, by all means, give us a call. We would love to get some more trees out here, so the more the better. And again, we can certainly get you on that board, and we don't even have to apply for a grant for these. Some other opportunities, not only do we have those 10 million trees that we can get, we can apply for grants to get a multifunctional riparian buffer. We also advocate for the CREP program, which stands for Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is through the SSA and the NRCS. But the Conservation District can certainly set you up with those as well. And they primarily are looking at setting aside properties for wildlife habitat. We also have other grants that we can do. We can work with farmers that have farming. We can have the Buffer Bonus Program is actually a program where for every acre of trees that you plant, they actually give you additional funding to do other agricultural BMPs. So if you need like a stream crossing or some fencing or something like manure storage, they can get you extra money to do that. The Pollinator Partnership is a growing opportunity that's going to be coming out. It's going to encourage people to plant more pollinator habitat on their properties. And there's just more and more coming out all the time. So again, the first place to start, if you guys are interested in these opportunities, give me a call or just send me an email. I'm more than happy to come out and check the property out, see what options we can do, and hopefully we can design, you know, a buffer for your property, and I can apply for a grant. Really, all I would need is your, you know, permission to get them planted. I would handle the grant writing process, and hopefully, if it would get approved, we'd be able to get those trees in the ground for you. So, if you're interested in that, please give me a call, and we'll see if we can get you set up with some trees. Just a couple of other ideas if you guys are thinking about what else you can do in your backyard for stormwater management. Rain gardens and rain barrels are always encouraged. Also, replacing your impervious surfaces with more permeable surfaces. So if you have a paved driveway or something like that, but looking into permeable pavement would be an option for you. Also, as you have grass clippings and leaves, I encourage you to just kind of mulch them up and leave them on your lawn. It acts as a natural fertilizer, which improves your soil health, and it also reduces the synthetic chemicals on your property. And of course, once again, you'll want to plant some native plants. And on that note of native plants, next week we're actually going to be doing another Lunch and Learn because I've been getting a lot of requests about talking specifically about native plants. So if you guys want to go ahead and sign up for our native plant webinar, I'll be putting that on next Friday at noon. Now, I don't know if you guys can click on that link, so I'm going to put it in the chat box right now. So if you guys want to head on over to that chat box, I don't know why it's not becoming a link, but if you guys want to head on over to that, you can register to get the link just like you did for this webinar. And it's also on our website as well. So if you're not able to get there, go to our website and you can register for that webinar as well. So with that, I am all done with my presentation. So I'm going to open it up to questions right now. So I'm just going to scroll back up and look at everyone's questions. But if you have any, feel free to hang out here and let me know what you're thinking. Or if you have any off-topic questions or suggestions, by all means, I'd love to hear them. So let's get started here. I'll try to find the first question we have. Someone mentioned Japanese knotweed in there too. That's something I would actually like to cover for next week's webinar. Not only am I going to talk about native plants, but I'm really going to talk about non-native plants as well, because I think it's important to identify those and really manage for invasive species before we start thinking about planting native species. The native species are going to come and they're going to thrive no matter what. But if we have invasive species on the land, it's really hard for those plants to compete with them. Someone asked, how much land do you need for grants? You honestly don't need too much land at all. Most of these grants are going to prioritize if you live along a stream. So if it's for a stream-side buffer, that's probably going to prioritize, put you higher on the list for the grants there. But again, that keeps them 10 million trees. I don't even have to apply for a grant. I just require at least 100 trees or more. And I would encourage you to find your own volunteers to be able to plant the trees as well. I mean, unless you're up to the task of planting 100 or more on your own, you may want to get a group there. So you really don't need much land whatsoever. You more or less just need to kind of show me, you know, what your problem areas are, if you could use some trees, and then we can go from there. It's actually a very simple process. Yes, I will upload this presentation because I know it's different than the presentation on our Conservation District website. So hopefully by this weekend, I'll have the recording of this and the presentation uploaded onto our website. Definitely by Monday, you should see it. So if you guys want to share this to anyone else, by all means, feel free. In fact, I encourage it. The more that are educated about the subject, the better. So definitely, I will put that on the website. Jen asked if there's any suggestions for how to start native wildflowers into a grassland. She started a ton by seed. They've been overtaken by small stuff. Personally, I actually did the same thing. I went out and I just started by seed. I've been lucky enough that they've been coming up and not been taken over by grasses. And I'm not really sure, why that is. I think my grasses just for some reason didn't grow very tall. But maybe try to look at different types of wildflowers that specifically grow taller. Something like a purple coneflower or bee balm that grows really tall might be more beneficial for you than something that's lower to the ground. Another resource you guys can look into for specifically thinking about, gardening and grasslands and pollinator habitat. I definitely encourage you guys to reach out to the master gardeners over at Penn State Extension. They are a huge resource that knows a lot more than I do about gardening and stuff like this. So if you do have some issues dealing with establishing, these native wildflowers, they may be a great resource to come out and help you out with that. Sammy asked if there's any programs like this available in Lycoming County. I am not entirely sure what they're up to, but you can definitely reach out to their conservation district and at least ask them. I'm sure their watershed specialists or education specialists up there would be happy to do something like this. But by all means, yeah, just definitely reach out to them. I'm not really sure exactly what Lycoming County is planning, though. Michelle would like to see the slide with the gestation period. All right, I can do that. There you go. Melissa asked, what's a good substitute for existing invasive English ivy on a really steep creek bank that is very shaded? That's a good question. Ivy and things that are vining are going to be a lot more difficult to manage because they're really fast-growing things. Again, I'm going to defer to Penn State Master Gardeners on that one. They would know a lot better than I would about different plant species and how they behave and how to establish something more beneficial than the other. Not my area of expertise. I'm more of a tree person, but yeah, definitely check out Penn State Extension. I think they'd be able to help you out a little better than us. Then says, it seems like your policymakers are for what you're doing regarding more trees, helping the riparian buffers, mine policymakers in Plum, Allegheny County. How do you get your lawmakers on board? Honestly, we really haven't talked to too many of our lawmakers. I think it has a lot to do with the efforts of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and other foundations and nonprofits like that, like Trout Unlimited, that is really focusing on environmental conservation. So they're doing a lot more policy work than we are. But by all means, reach out to your local policymakers and lawmakers and express your concerns about them and tell them, I want to get more trees out in this area. What can we do and what programs, can we have? And also reach out to your own local conservation district. Every county in Pennsylvania has their own conservation district. So they might be able to get you on board with some of these grant programs that we have as well. Kevin asked, what are the couple of streams in the northern tip of Swinney County that are non-attaining streams? Those are streams that are actually affected by acid rain. So up in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, we have a lot of, unfortunately, more mining and stuff like that going on. But also just emissions from all of the nearby cities that we have. They go in the atmosphere. It's interesting, I talked about the watershed earlier, but we actually have what's called I think it's called like the airshed, which basically is looking at, when we emit things into the atmosphere, where does that air go? And, things that are generated over in New York City end up somewhere here in Pennsylvania and vice versa. So there's actually acid rain that happens a lot up in the northern tier of the county that's impairing those streams. Cindy asked, what exactly is a rain garden? Rain gardens are actually, it's a garden, but it's an engineered garden. So you actually specifically go in and you dig out an area and you basically improve the ability for water to be infiltrated in that area by adding, rocks and other things that are able to percolate water better, and then improving soil there as well. On top of that, you'll plant water-loving type plants, so plants that can tolerate water and fit in it and absorb water more better would be chosen for those. And there's also trees and stuff like that as well. That's probably a really bad description of a rain garden. But there definitely are a ton of resources out there for rain gardens. I keep talking about Penn State Extension, but if you go on their website, they have a ton of information about rain gardens in particular. And also those master gardeners that I keep mentioning can help you design your own rain garden as well. So yeah, definitely look into rain gardens. They're actually pretty, you can have a small rain garden just in your own yard. And I've also seen municipalities that have really large rain gardens, in a community space. So you really can get creative with them. But again, they're pretty much just an engineered device using native plants and improving the soil structure to be able to infiltrate more water in the environment. All right, Jen, looks like you have a question about trees. Hold on, let me scroll up here. What can you plant in a riparian area that was stripped 4 years ago up to the edge? So riparian areas, you're probably going to want to get some trees that can tolerate moisture. One of the first trees to colonize an area like that would be a maple or even a red maple, which fortunately are very common around here. So maples are definitely an option. Swamp white oak, you want to make sure it's swamp white oak and not just white oak, but that is also very tolerant of wet soils. However, they do grow pretty slow, so I wouldn't count on them. River birch are very common around here, and they will grow quite quickly. So river birch are another option. You can look into shrubs like elderberries, winterberry holly. There really are a ton of shrubs. Any type of dogwood. And then something that I always recommend is black willow. They actually absorb a ton of water. It's actually amazing how much water they absorb. And they also are really, really quick growing. So they kind of act more like a shrub than a tree. But those are just a couple of plants that you can get in there to stabilize a bank if you're looking to do that to move them later. And again, you can feel free, everyone, to reach out to me, email me, or give me a call. I can send you guys some more resources regarding specific tree species if you're trying to stabilize your lawn there. Any other questions out there? Again, doesn't have to be on the topic. I'm happy to talk about anything. So any questions you have, send them my way. We have about 10 minutes left to the webinar, so I'm happy to stay on here. I'm going to scroll ahead again to my contact information. If you guys do want to contact me directly and have a better chat about what your goals are, by all means, reach out to me, especially since I'm not in the office. I'd love any excuse to get out and look at a site. So please get me out of the office and give me a call. I'd love to come look at your property. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, we may wrap this up. Let's see, another question came in here. Oh, yeah. Definitely a lot of, all the municipalities around Pennsylvania are looking into stormwater management. So that's definitely something that will be addressed, hopefully more and more as the years go by. But by all means, if you guys kind of want to be proactive, or honestly, you can even share this presentation with them. By all means, I'm even happy to, talk to someone on the phone if it helps establish more no-mow zones in Pennsylvania. I'm happy to talk to people even outside of Columbia County. And again, a bunch of people are interested in next week's presentation, so I'll put the link back up there again. If you guys want to register for that, I'll be talking about native plants, and I'll also be talking about some invasive species so that we can, identify what's good and what's bad, and try to make more natural habitats for our environment here. Someone asked if ticks are more likely in a high grass area, especially near the woods. So yes and no. So something you'll notice is that if it's a highly disturbed area, you're going to find more ticks. So if it's a relatively new forest, yes, definitely high grasses are going to be a huge concern for you. There's also invasive species such as Japanese barberry. So there's actually, it's a plant and it's pretty pokey and it's got a red berry to it, but they've actually found that they are really good at harboring ticks. So the more invasive species you have tends to give you more ticks. as well as the high grasses. However, if you go to a really well-established forest, like if you go out in the wiser forest area, very rarely will you find ticks. You will, but not nearly as many as if you go out into a younger forest, because you have that biodiversity and you have, predators of ticks and less mice and all of those kind of factors that go into, breeding for Lyme disease. So in most cases, if you're in a more suburban kind of landscape, yes, I would say a high grass area would help ticks to kind of thrive better, but also as long as you're also managing for wildlife, if you have, for example, possums are really good at eating a lot of ticks, and also managing for mice, because mice are actually what give the ticks the bacteria in the first place. So if you actually manage for those types of factors, you're less likely to find ticks. As long as you have a healthy biodiversity, generally you're going to have less ticks in the environment. So the answer is kind of yes and no. You'll find them more in high grass areas, but it depends how those areas are going to be maintained. Yes, bring in the possums. Possums are very awesome, and they're so good for the environment. And yes, the black snakes, even though me personally, I hate snakes and I don't like to see them at all, but I do like to know that they're in the environment because they do eat the mice. And like I mentioned earlier, mice are largely a big driver of when the ticks get infected with Lyme disease. So if you have less mice, you typically have less rates of Lyme disease. So yeah, snakes are actually really good for the environment because they eat the mice and prevent Lyme disease from spreading. Clay soils are going to be really difficult because it's very hard for roots to establish in that type of soil because it's just so compact. That is an interesting question. Honestly, I would love to do some more research on that. If you want to give me an email, actually, remind me how to get in contact with you. I'll do some research on that, and I'll send you a couple of ideas to see what we can do to get some more trees and grasses in a clay soil environment. That is definitely an interesting question. Sweet. I will save your email, and I will definitely get back to you next week on that one. That is something I'm also interested in. Got about 3 minutes left. If there's any other questions out there, happy to stick around. All right, Michelle, I'll definitely see you in that one. Looks like there's a link there that might possibly answer some of your questions there about small trees for clay soils. Thank you, Jenny. All right, guys, so it's about time to wrap up. The webinar is going to end on me pretty soon. So I'm just going to end it here. Again, thank you, everyone, for participating. Hopefully this recording will be up by the end of the weekend. I hope you guys have a really great weekend. Hopefully we don't get too much storm water, and hopefully we get some sunny weather so you guys can enjoy your backyard. And maybe even go outside and start thinking about where you can put your next no-mow zone. So thank you again, everyone, for coming in. I really appreciate it, and I hope you guys have a really great weekend.